The message arrived on the human research ship Endeavour like a silver bolt from space itself. Dr. Katie Rodriguez stared at the holographic display floating above her desk in the science lab. The elegant symbols shifted and twisted in patterns that hurt her eyes to follow, but the translation software had done its work. The words appeared clear and simple beneath the alien writing. Commander Lisa Hayes stood behind Katie, reading over her shoulder. Both women knew this was big. The Zephyr had never contacted humans directly before. These tall silver beings ruled a massive empire that stretched across dozens of star systems. They were known throughout the galaxy for their advanced technology and their skill in warfare. No one had ever defeated them in battle. Their ships could destroy planets, and their soldiers moved like ghosts through space. The invitation was simple, yet formal. The Zephyrian Empire requested that humanity send one representative to participate in their most sacred tradition, the strategic combat simulation. This was not just any contest, but a test that determined which species had the right to call themselves true warriors. The message explained that many alien races had tried and failed. Only the strongest and smartest could hope to succeed. Lisa walked to the large window that showed the stars outside. Her reflection looked back at her, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and tired eyes. She had commanded ships for 20 years, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The human race was still new to the galactic community. They had only made contact with other species. 5 years ago, most aliens still saw them as primitive creatures who had barely learned to leave their home planet. Katie joined her at the window. The young scientist had dedicated her life to studying alien cultures. She knew more about the Zephyrians than anyone else on the ship. Their society was built around the concept of perfect strategy and flawless execution. They believed that true strength came from the mind, not just the body. Their combat simulations were legendary tests that pushed participants to their absolute limits. The rules were strict and clear. No weapons of any kind would be allowed in the simulation. Participants could bring only one personal item that could not be classified as a weapon by any reasonable definition. The environment would be completely virtual, but the physics would be real. Every action would have consequences, and every mistake could mean failure. Lisa called for an emergency meeting in the main conference room. Within an hour, the senior staff had gathered around the long metal table. The room buzzed with nervous energy as everyone tried to understand what this invitation really meant. Marine Staff Sergeant Amy Chen sat at the far end of the table. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and her black hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She had joined the mission as head of security, but her real job was to protect the crew from any threats they might encounter in space. She was 30 years old and had spent half her life in the military. Her record showed combat experience on 3 different worlds and commendations for bravery. Under fire, Dr. Rodriguez explained what she knew about Zephyrian culture. Their empire was ancient by human standards. They had been exploring space when humans were still learning to make fire. Their technology was so advanced that it seemed like magic to most other species. They could create solid objects out of pure energy, and their computers could predict the future with scary accuracy. The combat simulations were more than just games. They were religious ceremonies that connected the Zephyrians to their ancestors. Every battle was recorded and studied for thousands of years. The winners became legends, whose names were remembered forever. The losers were forgotten, as if they had never existed at all. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brooks raised her hand. She was the ship navigator and had a reputation for asking tough questions. What happens if we lose? She wanted to know. The message did not say anything about consequences for failure. Katie looked through her notes again. The Zephyrians believed that losing the simulation meant a species was not ready for true membership in the galactic community. They would still be allowed to exist, but they would never be taken seriously by other races. Trade agreements would be harder to negotiate, and diplomatic relations would suffer for generations. But winning was almost impossible. The simulation was designed by the Zephyrians themselves. They understood every detail of how it worked. They had participated in hundreds of these contests over the centuries. Their strategies were perfect, and their execution was flawless. No alien species had ever managed to surprise them or catch them off guard. Amy listened to all of this without saying a word. She understood the stakes better than anyone. If humanity failed this test, they would remain second-class citizens in a galaxy full of advanced civilizations. But if they succeeded, they would earn respect that could change everything for the human race. The discussion went on for hours. Different crew members suggested different approaches. The science team wanted to send someone with advanced knowledge of physics and engineering. The diplomatic corps thought a skilled negotiator would be best. The medical staff argued for someone who understood alien psychology. Finally, Lisa asked the question that everyone was thinking: who should? Amy stood up slowly. Her boots made soft sounds on the metal floor as she walked to the front of the room. She had been thinking about this problem since the meeting started. The Zephyrians expected aliens to bring sophisticated tools and advanced technology. They would be prepared for computers and scientific instruments and complex devices. But humans were different. They had something that other species lacked: the ability to think outside normal patterns and find solutions that made no sense to logical minds. This was both their greatest strength and their biggest weakness in dealing with alien cultures. Nimi reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden object. It was a yo-yo that her grandfather had made for her when she was 8 years old. The wood was smooth from years of use, and the string was frayed but still strong. She had carried it with her through every mission and every battle. It was her good luck charm and her connection to home. The room fell silent as everyone stared at the simple toy. Lisa was the first to speak. "Are you serious?" Me nodded. "The rules say no weapons, but they do not define what counts as a tool or equipment. This looks like a toy, but it is actually a complex mechanical device. It uses gravity and momentum and rotational energy in ways that most aliens would never think of. The Zephyrians will expect us to bring something impressive and technological, but sometimes the simplest approach is the most effective." Dar Rodriguez frowned. She had studied hundreds of alien cultures, and none of them would ever consider a yo to be useful in combat. But Amy had a point. Humans had a long history of winning battles through unexpected tactics and creative thinking. Maybe that was exactly what they needed here. The debate continued for another hour, but in the end, there was really no choice. Amy was the most qualified person for this mission. She had combat experience and tactical training, but more importantly, she had the kind of mind that could find opportunities where others saw only problems. Lisa made the decision official. Amy would represent humanity in this combat simulation. She would bring her yo-yo as her one personal item. The rest of the crew would provide support and advice, but ultimately the success or failure would rest on her shoulders. Alone 3 days later, a Zephyrian ship arrived to collect Amy. The vessel was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. It looked like it was made of liquid silver that had been frozen in the shape of a flower. The hull reflected the stars in patterns that seemed to move and shift even when the ship was perfectly still. Amy packed light. She wore her dress uniform and carried only the yo-yo and a small bag with basic supplies. The Zephyrian representative who came aboard was a tall, elegant female with silver skin and crystal blue eyes. Her name was Valterra, and she moved with the grace of a dancer. Her voice was like music when she spoke, but there was steel underneath. The beauty Valterra examined the yo-yo with polite curiosity. She had never seen anything like it before. The concept of a toy that required skill to operate properly was foreign to Zephyrian culture. Their children learned through advanced computer simulations, not simple mechanical devices. Amy demonstrated a few basic tricks. The yo-yo spun down and up again with smooth precision. She made it sleep at the bottom of the string, then walk across the floor. Valterra watched with the kind of attention that scientists give to interesting but harmless specimens. The trip to the Zephyrian homeworld took 6 hours. Amy spent most of the time meditating and practicing with her yo-yo. She knew that she would face opponents who had trained their entire lives for this moment. They would have access to advanced technology and centuries of tactical knowledge. Her only advantages were creativity and the element of surprise. As they approached the planet, Amy got her first look at Zephyrian civilization. The cities were works of art that stretched up toward the sky, like crystal flowers. The buildings seemed to grow rather than being built, and everything reflected light in ways that created rainbow patterns across the landscape. Terra explained that the simulation would take place in the Grand Arena, a massive dome structure at the heart of the capital city. Millions of Zephyrians would watch the contest, and the results would be broadcast across the Empire. Amy would be facing two opponents, Valterra herself, and a warrior from the Sauron Federation named Kixandra. Amy stood in the center of the massive crystal dome that housed the Zephyrian combat simulation. The structure reached high above her head like the inside of a giant diamond. Each surface reflected light in different colors, creating patterns that moved and shifted with each breath she took. The floor beneath her feet felt solid, but she knew it was really made of hard light, technology that could change into anything the simulation required. Thousands of Zephyrians filled the viewing galleries that surrounded the arena. Their silver faces showed no emotion, but Amy could feel their eyes watching her every movement. They had come to see another alien species fail against their perfect system. She was just the latest in a long line of challengers who thought they could match Zephyrian strategic superiority. Terra entered from the opposite side of the arena. She moved with fluid grace, her silver skin catching the light from the crystal walls. In her hands, she carried an ornate crystal device that pulsed with inner energy. Amy recognized it from her briefings. It was a hard light projector that could create solid objects out of pure energy. Bridges, platforms, walls, weapons, anything the user could imagine could be made real within the simulation environment. The third competitor arrived through a side entrance. Kixandra was everything Amy had expected from a Sauron warrior. She stood 7 feet tall, with emerald green scales that covered her body like natural armor. Her eyes were golden and moved, constantly scanning for threats and opportunities. Her weapon was a tactical cloak that would make her nearly invisible to normal sight. Amy could see the device clipped to her belt, a small disc that projected an energy field around. The user of the arena began to change around them. Reality shifted and flowed as the quantum processors created the simulation environment. Buildings rose from the floor like growing plants. The crystal dome became a sky filled with artificial clouds. Streets and alleyways appeared between the structures, complete with vehicles and obstacles that could provide cover or create hazards. Amy found herself standing in what looked like a futuristic city. The buildings were tall and narrow with bridges connecting them at different levels. The streets below were filled with abandoned vehicles and debris that could be used as weapons or tools. The environment was designed to test every aspect of combat strategy, from close quarters fighting to long-range tactics. A voice echoed through the simulation, space explaining the rules to all participants and observers. The objective was simple. Each competitor had to capture and hold 3 strategic points for 10 consecutive minutes. The points were marked by glowing beacons, located at different positions throughout the virtual city. Holding 2 points for 5 minutes would also count as a partial victory, but only total control would bring true success. The strategic points were positioned to force conflict. The first was located on a rooftop, accessible only by climbing or flying. The second was in an underground tunnel system that provided multiple entry and exit routes. The third was at the top of the central tower, the tallest structure. In the simulation, this placement meant that competitors would have to move constantly and fight for control of key positions. Amy checked her yo-yo one more time. The simple wooden toy felt strange in her hands compared to the advanced technology her opponents carried, but she had studied the simulation rules carefully and found no restrictions on creative tool usage. The Zephyrians had designed their contest to test strategic thinking, not limit creative problem solving. The countdown began. 10 seconds until the simulation started. Amy took deep breaths and tried to center her mind. She had trained for situations like this, but never against opponents with such overwhelming technological advantages. Her only hope was to think differently than they expected. Valterra raised her crystal device and began channeling energy into it. The hard light projector responded by creating a shimmering platform beneath her feet. She rose into the air with elegant precision, heading directly toward the rooftop beacon. Her movements were calculated and efficient, showing the strategic thinking that made Zephyrians feared. Throughout the galaxy's Andra activated her cloak and disappeared from sight. Amy could still hear her footsteps moving toward the underground tunnel entrance, but tracking her exact position became nearly impossible. The Sauron warrior was using stealth tactics to claim the second strategic point. While avoiding direct confrontation, Amy ran toward the nearest building, looking for a way to reach higher ground. The walls were smooth and offered few handholds for climbing, but she noticed that the architecture included decorative elements that could serve as anchor points. She pulled out her yo-yo and began testing its capabilities in the virtual environment. The simulation responded to the yo-yo as if it were a real physical object. The string held weight, and the wooden disc spun with realistic momentum. Amy realized that the Zephyrian programmers had created perfect physics simulation without considering how those physics could be exploited by creative thinking. She tied the yo-yo string to a decorative projection on the building wall, then used the weight of the yo-yo itself as a pendulum. The simple mechanical advantage allowed her to swing across a gap between buildings that would have been impossible to jump. Amy felt a surge of confidence as she realized her unconventional approach was working well. Tara had already claimed the rooftop beacon and was using her hard light projector to create defensive barriers around the position. Her crystal device generated walls and obstacles that would make it difficult for opponents to approach without being detected. Amy could see the silver figure standing confidently behind her fortifications. Meanwhile, Kixandra had reached the underground tunnel system, her cloak making her nearly impossible to track. The Sauron warrior was methodically searching the passages, looking for the best defensive position. She would wait for her opponents to come to her, then use her natural strength and predatory instincts to defeat them in close combat. Me needed a different strategy. She could not match Velterra technological advantages or Kixandra physical superiority, but humans had won battles throughout history by refusing to fight on their enemies' terms. She would have to create her own rules for this contest. The central tower loomed above the simulation city, reaching almost to the crystal dome ceiling. Amy studied its structure, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. The building was designed to be difficult to climb with smooth walls and few windows, but she noticed that it was connected to other buildings by a network of bridges and walkways. Amy began moving through the city, using her yo-yo in ways the simulation designers had never considered. She used it as a grappling hook to swing between buildings. The string could be wrapped around pipes and structural elements to create zip lines that allowed rapid movement across open spaces. When she needed to distract opponents, she threw the yo-yo. Two trigger switches or knock objects over the physics engine treated every action as legitimate. Because the yo-yo was officially classified as a non-weapon device, Amy realized she could push the boundaries of what was possible within the simulation rules. The programmers had focused on preventing traditional weapons, but had not considered how simple tools could be weaponized. Through creative thinking, she reached the base of the central tower and began studying the bridges that connected it to surrounding buildings. The supports looked strong, but Amy noticed that they were held in place by mechanical joints that could be manipulated. The yo-yo string was thin enough to thread through small gaps, and the wooden disc was heavy enough to create significant force when spinning. Amy began wrapping the yo-yo string around one of the bridge supports, using the principles of mechanical advantage to create leverage. She did not need to break the bridge, just alter its position enough to create a new path to the tower. The simulation physics responded to her actions as if they were completely normal. Tara noticed movement near the central tower and began directing hard light constructs toward Amy's position. But the human was already moving, using her yo-yo to swing from one building to another in patterns that were difficult to predict. The Zephyrian strategic mind was having trouble calculating Amy's next move because her tactics followed no logical pattern. Kicks Andra emerged from the tunnel system, having claimed the second strategic point. Her golden eyes scanned the area, looking for targets to engage. The Sauron warrior expected her opponents to approach her position directly, but Amy was nowhere to be seen. The human had disappeared into the maze of buildings and bridges that filled the simulation space. Sami was learning to use the urban environment. To her advantage, she discovered that the yo-yo could be used to measure distances by counting string length. This allowed her to judge gaps and heights with surprising accuracy. She also found that the spinning motion could be used to detect air, currents, and movement that might indicate hidden opponents. The simulation began to show signs of strain as Amy pushed the physics engine in unexpected directions. Her unconventional use of the yo-yo was creating calculations that the programmers had never anticipated. The quantum processors were working harder to track all the variables created by her. Creative tactics. Sami reached a position where she could see all three strategic points. Velterra controlled the rooftop with her hard light barriers. Kix Andra held the underground tunnel with her stealth cloak. The central tower remained unclaimed, but heavily defended by both opponents who expected Amy to make a direct assault. Instead, Amy began implementing a plan that would use the simulation's own rules against itself. She had noticed that the physics engine treated the yo-yo string as having infinite tensile strength within reasonable limits. This meant she could create mechanical systems that would be impossible with real materials. She began stringing the yo-yo between multiple anchor points, creating a web of connections that spanned several buildings. The pattern looked random, but Amy was actually building a primitive computer using mechanical principles. The string tensions and yo-yo positions could be used to calculate optimal approach routes and timing for simultaneous attacks on all three positions. Velterra and Kix Andra watched Amy movements with growing concern. Neither opponent understood what the human was trying to accomplish. Her actions seemed pointless and random, but both warriors had enough combat experience to recognize purposeful activity, even when they could not comprehend the purpose. The timer showed that Velterra had controlled her beacon for 3 minutes, while Kix Andra had held hers for 2. Amy had not claimed any strategic points yet, but she was not showing signs of panic or desperation. Instead, she continued building her string network with methodical precision. Amy pulled out the yo-yo and began performing tricks she had learned as a child. The wooden disc spun in complex patterns around the world. Rock the baby, walk the dog. Each trick served a dual purpose, entertaining the crowd while testing the string tension and mechanical properties of her improvised system. The Zephyrian audience began murmuring among themselves. They had never seen anything like this before. Most challengers either attacked directly or tried to use advanced technology to overcome their opponents. Amy was treating the combat simulation like a playground game, but with deadly serious concentration. Amy completed her preparations and began moving toward her real objective. She had spent the first part of the simulation studying her opponents and the environment while building the tools she would need for victory. Now, it was time to show both aliens what human creativity could accomplish when properly applied. The yo-yo spun at the end of its string. As Amy approached the central tower, she had found a way to reach the top that neither opponent would expect. Her unconventional tactics were about to turn the simulation upside down. Amy began her assault on the simulation in ways that defied every tactical manual ever written. She used her yo-yo as a grappling hook, but not in the obvious way that her opponents expected. Instead of throwing it upward to catch ledges, she threw it sideways to wrap around vertical pipes and structural supports. This created swing points that allowed her to move horizontally between buildings at speeds that made tracking her position nearly impossible. Velterra tried to predict Amy movements using advanced Zephyrian strategic algorithms, but every calculation failed. The human refused to follow logical patterns or take the most efficient routes. Instead, she bounced between buildings like a rubber ball, creating chaos in what should have been an orderly tactical engagement. The yo-yo string proved to be far more versatile than anyone had imagined. Amy discovered she could use it to measure distances by counting the string length. As it unwound, this gave her precise information about gaps, heights, and obstacles, without needing any electronic measuring tools. She began mapping the entire simulation environment, using nothing but string length and basic geometrics. Andra emerged from her tunnel position to investigate the strange sounds coming from above. Her predatory instincts told her that prey was moving through her territory, but she could not locate the source of the disturbance. The Sauron warrior had expected direct confrontation, not this bizarre game of three-dimensional hide and seek. Amy dropped her yo-yo from a high bridge and let it swing like a pendulum. The weighted disc knocked over a stack of debris that crashed into the street below. Kixandra immediately moved toward the sound, but found nothing except scattered objects. Amy was already 3 buildings away, using her string network to move through the urban maze. The physics engine began calculating forces and tensions that pushed the simulation to its limits. Amy had created a web of string connections that turned the entire city into one massive mechanical device. Every movement she made affected multiple other points, creating ripple effects that confused both the tracking systems and her opponents. Terra used her hard light projector to create floating platforms that would give her a better view of the battlefield. But Amy had anticipated this move. She had positioned several yo-yo anchor points in locations that would create blind spots even for aerial observers. The Zephyrian found herself playing a guessing game against an opponent who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. At once Amy discovered that she could walk the dog along power cables using the yo-yo momentum to slide across electrical lines. The string acted as an insulator, preventing electrical shock, while the spinning disc provided the momentum needed to traverse long distances. This technique allowed her to access areas of the simulation that were supposed to be unreachable. The central tower had been designed with limited access points to force competitors into predictable approach routes, but Amy found that she could reach the structure by using power lines as highways through the sky. The yo-yo became her vehicle for a journey that the simulation designers had never considered. Andra watched in amazement as a small figure slid down an electrical cable toward the tower. The Sauron warrior had positioned herself to defend against ground approaches and climbing attempts, but had never considered that someone might use the power grid as a transportation system. Amy reached the tower and began climbing using techniques that combined traditional mountaineering with yo-yo physics. She wrapped the string around structural elements to create belay points, then used the yo-yo weight to test the strength of each anchor before committing her full body weight. The simple wooden toy became a sophisticated climbing aid. Terra realized that the human was approaching the central beacon and began directing hard light constructs to intercept her, but Amy had planned for this response. She had already positioned yo-yo anchor points that would allow her to swing away from danger at a moment's notice. Her escape routes were built into the climbing path itself. The audience of Zephyrians began showing visible signs of confusion and concern. Their perfect simulation was being turned into something they did not recognize. The human was using physics in ways that their strategic minds could not process or predict. Every move seemed random, but produced results that suggested careful planning. Amy reached a position where she could see the central beacon, but getting to it would require crossing an open area, where she would be vulnerable to attack from both opponents. She needed a distraction that would force them to divide their attention between multiple threats. She began setting up what she privately called her chaos engine, using the yo-yo string to connect multiple mechanical elements throughout the tower structure. When activated, this system would create a cascade of falling objects, swinging barriers, and moving platforms that would make the area around the beacon nearly impossible to navigate safely. Andra had abandoned her tunnel position and was climbing the tower using her natural strength and clawed hands. The Sauron warrior moved with predatory grace, but her direct approach made her position easy to track. Amy knew exactly where her opponent would be at any given moment. Amy triggered her chaos engine by pulling on a single string that was connected to dozens of other anchor points throughout the structure. The result was spectacular. Debris began falling, platforms started swinging, and mechanical elements that had been stable suddenly became mobile. The tower transformed from a static structure into a dynamic obstacle course. Valterra tried to use her hard light projector to create stable platforms in the chaos, but the constantly moving environment made it impossible to establish secure positions. Her elegant crystal constructs were beautiful, but they could not adapt quickly enough to the changing conditions that Amy had created. Andra found herself trapped between falling objects and swinging barriers. The Sauron warrior physical strength was useless against obstacles that moved in unpredictable patterns. She could dodge individual threats, but the sheer number of moving parts made progress nearly impossible. Amy used the chaos to her advantage. She had designed the system to create clear paths for someone who knew the timing and sequence of movements. The yo-yo became her key to navigating the mechanical maze she had built. The string could be used to trigger specific elements while avoiding others. She reached the central beacon during the height of the chaos and planted her marker, claiming the first strategic point, but instead of staying to defend the position, Amy immediately began moving toward the rooftop beacon. Her unconventional strategy called for rapid strikes rather than static defense. The simulation systems began showing error messages as they tried to track all the moving elements that Amy had set in motion. The quantum processors were handling calculations that pushed them beyond their design specifications. The simple yo-yo was creating computational loads that the Zephyrian programmers had never anticipated. Amy swung through the air, using her string network to move from the central tower toward the rooftop position. Valterra had fortified her hard light barriers, looked impregnable, but Amy had noticed that they were anchored to specific points on the building structure. If those anchor points could be moved, the entire defensive system would collapse. She landed on a neighboring rooftop and began using her yo-yo to create mechanical leverage against the barrier anchor points. The string was thin enough to thread through small gaps in the hard light constructs, and the spinning disc could generate significant rotational force when properly applied. Valterra watched in disbelief as her perfect defenses began to shift and wobble. The hard light barriers were still solid, but their positions were changing in ways that created gaps in her defensive perimeter. The human was not breaking through her defenses, she was moving them aside. Amy slipped through one of the gaps she had created and reached the rooftop beacon. Valterra tried to block her with new hard light constructs, but Amy was already moving, again using her yo-yo to swing away from the position before the Zephyrian could react. She had claimed the second strategic point and was already heading toward the third kicks. Andra had finally cleared the chaos engine and was climbing toward the central beacon that Amy had abandoned. The Sauron warrior expected to find it undefended, but discovered that the human had left behind a series of string traps that made approaching the beacon extremely dangerous. Moving platforms and swinging obstacles created a gauntlet that required perfect timing to navigate. The timer showed that Amy now controlled 2 of the 3 strategic points, but she needed to hold them for the required time, while preventing her opponents from establishing their own control. This meant she had to move constantly between positions, using her mobility advantage to stay ahead of their responses. Amy had turned the combat simulation into a 3-dimensional chess game, where the board itself was constantly changing. Her yo-yo tricks were no longer just movement techniques. They were strategic tools that allowed her to control space and time within the virtual environment. The Zephyrian audience fell silent as they watched their perfect system being systematically dismantled by a human with a toy. The simulation that had never been defeated was showing cracks and flaws that no one had ever noticed before. Amy's creative approach was revealing weaknesses in technology that had been considered flawless. Valterra and Andra began working together for the first time in the contest. They realized that their individual approaches were not sufficient against an opponent who refused to follow normal tactical patterns. Their combined technological and physical advantages should have been overwhelming, but Amy's unconventional methods were neutralizing their strengths. Amy noticed the cooperation between her opponents and adjusted her strategy accordingly. She began using her yo-yo to create environmental hazards that would force them to choose between pursuing her and avoiding dangerous obstacles. The simple wooden toy was becoming a weapon of psychological warfare. The simulation environment itself became Amy's greatest ally, as she pushed the physics engine to calculate increasingly complex mechanical interactions. The yo-yo string connections created cause and effect relationships that spanned the entire virtual city. Every action produced multiple reactions that cascaded through the system in unpredictable ways. Amy had successfully transformed a tactical combat simulation into a demonstration of human creativity and adaptability. Her opponents had superior technology and physical abilities, but they were trapped in conventional thinking patterns that prevented them from adapting to her unconventional approach. The yo-yo spun at the end of its string as Amy prepared for the final phase of her assault on the simulation. She had proven that human ingenuity could overcome any technological advantage when applied with sufficient creativity and determination. Amy discovered that the simulation physics engine was starting to struggle with her increasingly complex yo-yo maneuvers. The quantum processors that powered the virtual environment were designed to handle standard tactical scenarios, not the chaotic mechanical systems that she had created throughout the city. She began testing the limits of what the system could calculate by performing multiple yo-yo tricks simultaneously while moving through the environment. The wooden disc traced impossible paths through three-dimensional spaces. Amy combined around the world with Rock the Baby while walking the dog along a power line. The simulation tracking systems tried to follow the yo-yo position, but the rapid movements created calculation errors that spread through the entire virtual environment. Buildings began flickering slightly as the processors struggled to maintain consistent physics for all the objects Amy had set in motion. Tara noticed the system instability and tried to use her hard light projector to stabilize the environment around her position, but every construct she created added to the computational load, making the problem worse. Her elegant crystal device was actually helping Amy overload the simulation. Amy realized she could exploit these glitches to gain tactical advantages. In areas where the physics calculations were lagging, she could move through solid objects for brief moments before the system corrected itself. She began timing her movements to coincide with processor deleskics. Andra found herself trapped in a building that Amy had destabilized using yo-yo string connections. The structure was no longer behaving according to normal physics. Walls that should have been solid sometimes allowed passage, while floors that looked stable occasionally became transparent. Amy created her most ambitious mechanical system yet by connecting yo-yo strings to water pipes throughout the simulation city. She used the spinning disc to generate rotational energy that could be transferred through the string connections to manipulate water pressure in distant locations. The result was spectacular fountains erupted in strategic locations, creating visual barriers that blocked line of sight between opponents. Water began flowing through the streets in patterns that Amy could control by adjusting string tensions from her central position. Tara tried to create hard light bridges over the flooding areas, but the water pressure changes were happening too quickly for her to establish stable constructs. The elegant Zephyrian found herself constantly adjusting her position as the environment shifted beneath her feet. Amy discovered that she could use water as a conductor for the yo-yo string by coating it with mineral deposits from the stimulation environment. This allowed her to create electrical circuits that could remotely activate or deactivate systems throughout the virtual city. She began shutting down power grids in specific areas to force her opponents into predictable movement patterns. The darkness created tactical advantages for someone who knew the environment layout, while putting aliens who depended on visual targeting at a serious disadvantage. The simulation AI began throwing error messages as Amy's actions fell outside all programmed parameters. Her yo-yo had become the center of a web of cause and effect relationships that extended throughout the entire virtual environment. Every movement created ripples that affected dozens of other systems. Andra tried to use her natural night vision to navigate the darkened areas, but found that Amy had created sound traps using taut yo-yo strings that would vibrate when disturbed. These early warning systems allowed the human to track opponent movements, even in complete darkness. Amy positioned herself at the intersection of several yo-yo string lines and began using the vibrations to create a crude but effective sonar system. She could detect movement throughout a large section of the city by feeling the slight changes in string tension. The central beacon became the focus of a three-way battle, but Amy had turned the area into a mechanical maze that favored her unconventional movement style. She could swing through obstacles that forced her opponents to take longer routes or risk injury from moving parts. Valterra made a desperate attempt to reach the beacon, using her hard light projector to create a direct path through the chaos, but Amy had anticipated this move and used her yo-yo to redirect water flows that would destabilize any hard light constructs. In that area, the elegant crystal device began sparking as it tried to maintain constructs in an environment where the basic physics were being constantly manipulated. Amy yo-yo tricks were creating reality distortions that made stable hard light projection nearly impossible. Kixandra reached the beacon area but found herself facing a gauntlet of swinging obstacles and unstable platforms. The Sauron warrior natural agility was useless against hazards that moved in patterns controlled by Amy's string network. Amy began performing yo-yo tricks that defied the simulation understanding of object physics. She made the wooden disc appear to be in multiple locations simultaneously by moving it through quantum uncertainty zones created by processor overload. The tracking system lost the yo-yo completely for several seconds as Amy performed impossible combinations of tricks while moving at high speed. The simulation tried to compensate by increasing processor allocation, but this only made the instability worse. Buildings began losing structural integrity as the physics engine failed to maintain consistent calculations for all the mechanical forces. Amy had introduced walls, became permeable floors, turned into ramps, and gravity seemed to vary from one location to another. Amy used these reality distortions to reach positions that should have been impossible to access. She walked through walls during glitch moments and fell upward when gravitational calculations reversed. The yo-yo had become a key that could unlock any door in the virtual environment. Valterra hard light projector finally overloaded from trying to create stable constructs in an unstable environment. The crystal device cracked and went dark, leaving the Zephyrian with no technological advantages. The elegant alien found herself reduced to basic movement and observations. Andra cloak began malfunctioning as the simulation system struggled to maintain consistent light refraction calculations. The Sauron warrior invisibility flickered on and off, making her partially visible at random intervals. Amy realized that she had pushed the simulation beyond its design limits. The quantum processors were now spending more time calculating yo-yo physics than maintaining the basic virtual environment. The simple wooden toy had become a virus that was eating the system from within. She began the final phase of her attack by creating a yo-yo cascade that would trigger every mechanical system she had built throughout the simulation. Simultaneously, the string connections would transfer energy from one location to another, creating a chain reaction that would overwhelm the remaining processor capacity. The yo-yo spun faster than ever before as Amy prepared to execute the move that would either win the simulation or crash it completely. The wooden disc became a blur of motion that the tracking systems could no longer follow. Valterra and Kixandra both realized that something catastrophic was about to happen. They could see the strain in the simulation environment as reality itself began to break down around them. The human had found a way to weaponize the virtual world against itself. Amy released the yo-yo cascade and watched as every string connection throughout the city activated simultaneously. Water systems reversed direction, buildings began moving like living creatures, and the physics engine started calculating impossible scenarios. The simulation shuddered like a living thing in pain as quantum processors overheated, trying to maintain mathematical consistency in a world where the basic rules of reality were being constantly rewritten by a small wooden toy on a string. Error Messages flooded the system displays as the virtual environment began collapsing. In on itself, the perfect Zephyrian simulation was dying, killed by creative thinking and a child toy that refused to follow the rules. Sammy stood in the center of the chaos, holding her yo-yo. As the world collapsed around her, she had not just won the simulation, she had broken it in ways that would require complete redesign of the entire system. The wooden disc spun calmly at the end of its string as reality flickered and failed throughout the virtual city. Amy had proven that human creativity could overcome any technological challenge when applied with sufficient determination and willingness to think outside conventional patterns. The final battle took place in a reality that no longer followed consistent rules. Amy had pushed the simulation physics engine so far beyond its limits that the virtual environment had become a constantly shifting maze where normal tactics were impossible. Tara and Kixandra made their desperate last stand at the central tower beacon, but they were fighting in a world where walls moved, floors became ceilings, and gravity changed direction without warning. The perfect strategic minds that had made them legendary warriors could not adapt to chaos that defied all logical patterns. Amy climbed the tower, using her yo-yo as both tool and weapon, but her approach was unlike anything that had ever been recorded in combat simulation history. She performed tricks while moving through three-dimensional space, creating movement patterns that the tracking system could not follow or predict. Around the world became a method for swinging between anchor points that existed in different gravitational fields. The baby allowed her to navigate through walls that flickered between solid and permeable states. Walk the dog helped her slide along surfaces that changed orientation as she moved across them. The simulation AI made one final attempt to restore order by increasing processor allocation to maximum levels, but this only accelerated the breakdown. Every calculation created new errors that spread through the system. Like digital cancer, Amy began performing multiple yo-yo tricks simultaneously while climbing toward the beacon. The wooden disc traced impossible geometric patterns as it moved through space that was folding in on itself. The string connections she had created throughout the city were causing reality distortions that affected the entire virtual environment. Tara tried to reach the beacon using her damaged crystal device, but the hard light projector could no longer create stable constructs in an environment where the basic physics constants were changing every few seconds. Her elegant movements became clumsy and desperate as she struggled to maintain balance in a world gone mad. Kixandra fell through a floor that had been solid moments before and found herself in an upside-down room where water flowed toward the ceiling. The Sauron warrior predatory instincts were useless in an environment that no longer followed natural laws. Amy reached the beacon platform and began the most complex yo-yo routine she had ever attempted. She performed every trick she knew in rapid succession while the simulation systems tried desperately to track the wooden disc position through movements that defied mathematical description. The yo-yo appeared to be in dozens of locations simultaneously. As Amy moved through quantum uncertainty fields created by processor overload, she was performing sleight of hand magic with physics itself, using the simulation computational limits against its own stability. Around the world merged with Rock the Baby, which flowed into Walk the Dog, which became Sleeping Beauty, which transformed into Atomic Fire as Amy pushed her skills beyond anything she had ever done before. The yo-yo became a blur of motion that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. The simulation tracking system finally gave up trying to follow the yo-yo position and began displaying error messages that filled every available screen. The quantum processors were running calculations that produced results outside the bounds of programmed reality. Amy planted her flag at the central beacon, but instead of stopping, she continued her yo-yo routine. The wooden disc spun through space that was collapsing and reforming around her, while she performed tricks that should have been physically impossible. Terra crystal device exploded in a shower of sparks as the simulation energy grid overloaded. The elegant Zephyrian fell to her knees as her connection to the virtual environment was severed. leaving her powerless in a world that no longer recognized. Her Existence Andra cloak completely malfunctioned and began projecting random images instead of providing camouflage. The Sauron warrior found herself trapped in a visual feedback loop that made movement impossible without triggering vertigo and disorientation. Amy completed her yo-yo cascade and watched as the final system failures spread throughout the simulation like wildfire. Buildings dissolved into digital static. The sky became a kaleidoscope of broken pixels, and the ground beneath her feet turned into flowing liquid light. The central beacon flickered and went dark as the simulation lost the ability to maintain even basic environmental systems. Amy stood alone in a void filled with error messages and system warnings holding her yo as the virtual world died around her. Alarms began sounding throughout the Zephyrian facility as technicians realized that their perfect simulation had suffered total system failure. The quantum processors were overheating from trying to calculate impossible scenarios created by a simple wooden toy merge. Shutdown procedures activated automatically as the simulation AI made one final attempt to preserve core system integrity, but the damage was already done. Amy had found and exploited fundamental flaws in the way the Zephyrians processed reality. Crystal Dome began to flicker as power was diverted from the arena displays to cooling systems that were struggling to prevent permanent hardware damage. The audience of Zephyrians sat in stunned silence as their greatest technological achievement collapsed before their eyes. Amy felt the simulation environment dissolving around her, but she remained calm and focused. The yo-yo continued spinning at the end of its string as reality faded to digital nothingness. She had not just won the contest, she had proven that no system was perfect when faced with unlimited creativity. The virtual world disappeared completely, leaving Amy standing in the center of the crystal dome holding her grandfather wooden yo-yo. The silence was deafening as thousands of Zephyrians tried to process what they had just witnessed. Terra materialized beside Amy as the hard light systems came back online. The elegant Zephyrian looked shaken and confused. Her silver skin had lost some of its luster, and her crystal blue eyes showed something that might have been fear or respect. Andra appeared moments later, looking disoriented and angry. The Sauron warrior had never experienced defeat in any form, and the complete breakdown of her tactical worldview was difficult to accept. Amy calmly wound up her yo-yo string and put the wooden toy back in her pocket. She had accomplished something that no other species had ever managed. She had not just defeated the Zephyrian simulation, she had broken it so completely that it would require complete reconstruction. The arena fell silent, except for the sound of cooling fans working overtime to prevent system damage. Amy walked toward the exit with quiet confidence, knowing that she had changed the balance of power in the galaxy through creative thinking and determination. Terra followed her with hesitant steps. The proud Zephyrian had never before encountered a mind that could find solutions outside the boundaries of logical thought. Amy approached a problem-solving was unlike anything in Zephyrian strategic doctrine. Amy reached the exit and turned back to face the two alien warriors who had underestimated human creativity. The yo-yo was visible in her hand again as she performed one simple trick that both opponents had seen dozens of times during the contest walk. The dog looked innocent and harmless when performed in normal space, but both Terra and Andra now understood that they had witnessed something far more dangerous than any weapon they had seen. Human ingenuity applied without limits or constraints. Amy smiled and offered the yo-yo to Terra. The elegant Zephyrian reached out with trembling hands to accept the simple wooden toy that destroyed her people's greatest technological achievement. Arena systems began their slow restart process as technicians worked to repair the damage caused by Meek creative assault on reality. The simulation that had never been defeated would need to be completely redesigned from the ground up. Meek walked out of the crystal dome knowing that she had earned something more valuable than victory. She had gained the respect of species that had considered humans to be primitive and predictable. The galaxy would never underestimate human creativity again. Behind Her Valterra held the yo-yo with careful reverence, trying to understand how such a simple object could contain so much potential for chaos and change. The wooden disc felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of all human possibility. Within its simple form, the simulation had ended, but Amy's legacy was just beginning across the galaxy. Word would spread about the human who had broken the unbreakable system using nothing but creativity, determination, and a toy that refused to follow the rules.